Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I got to open up with a disclaimer. Everything I say here is my view, cannot be attributed to USDA, our Economic Research Service. So I'll make sure my boss is sitting up front and she understands that. Okay. Bill, thank you for that great introduction to the topic, the challenge that we face. I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into some of the things that Bill talked about, particularly on winners and losers and new trade opportunities, where they are, and the challenges that come with them. And finally, about trade negotiations. How can we negotiate in this particular context, very challenging environment? I might sound a little bit technical, but I'm trying to bring this back to the issues that we face, so bear with me as I go through this. If I want to answer the question, who are the winners and losers, I go back to 1700s and start with Ricardian. And Ricardo was the first one that proposed the model of comparative advantage. And in its very simple framework, relative productivity differences define trade. And so when you move from no trade to free trade, GDP increases. You maintain full employment in both situations, and wages go up, okay? And so we've had that story that nobody is really harmed by having trade in that particular context. Fast forward to the 20th century, we got resource endowment-based models where people talked about countries having abundant factors and scarce factors. And so you go from a no trade to a free trade equilibrium, and you find out that GDP goes up. You are going to specialize in the good in which you have comparative advantage, and the rewards to the factor that is abundant in your country, whether it is labor or capital, is going to benefit. And in a very simple 2x2x2 framework, you can actually show that the other factor is going to be affected negatively, even in nominal terms, not necessarily real, okay, in nominal terms. So when you look at the winners and losers in that context, it's going to be the people that are plenty here, or the capital that's plenty here, versus the other factor that is pretty scarce, okay? And then again, come back to the late 20th century, people were not satisfied with those explanations. They said, what about the fact that we export cars and import cars? What about the fact that we export beef and import beef? And then Krugman comes along and puts out a model, again, under the assumption of full employment, and talks about how internal scale economies and consumers' preference for variety, which we're going to talk about today, drive trade, okay? So again, when you move from a no trade to free trade, wages go up because prices fall. Wages are normalized to 1 in those models, so real wages actually go up, okay? So everybody's a winner, okay? So as you look at this traditional thinking, what you find is resources move freely across sectors, from one sector to other sector, or within the industry, they're easy to move, okay? And everybody inside the industry is the same. Nobody looks different, okay? We don't have big companies and small companies. And countries are like, these huge aggregates, and nobody cares about cities or rural areas or urban areas, developed areas, underdeveloped areas, and so on. So we had these aggregates, national sectors, and like everybody is the same type approach. And many of these evaluations are like one shot. You go from no trade to free trade, and then you look at the losses and gains, okay? We really don't appreciate the dynamic gains that come from trade in that context. So what are we doing now in this particular context now? We continue to believe productivity, your factor endowments, your resources, variety preferences drive trade, okay? But we can also learn what's happening within industries and within countries. And that's where the literature is headed right now, okay? The new models being proposed in trade, agriculture, as well as in mainstream, talk about the heterogeneity within the sectors. Okay, you got large farms, small farms, medium farms. You go to industries, you got large companies, medium companies, and small companies. And now you add a spatial dimension where they are located. The large companies are often located in urban areas, cities, and so on. The smaller ones in more, farther away type areas, okay? So you combine the heterogeneity inside the industry with the spatial heterogeneity. Now you're coming up with solutions that are very different than that you had before. When you said trade was good for an industry, now if you open up this intra-industry dimension and the spatial dimension and add them up, maybe not, okay? So the evolution in thinking has gone from aggregates of national industry sectors to regions, companies, and individual locations, okay? And that's been a very, very good thing for trade in particular because, as Bill mentioned, we have not been communicating the outcomes of trade effectively. And as you get closer to the region, closer to the people, okay, you then make a better case, this is what's gonna happen to you. If it is positive, you're gonna find the representative from that particular county or state supporting the trade. If it's gonna be negative, he or she is gonna demand an instrument, and kind of a trade adjustment assistant or something that ties to that area, that ties to that particular location, okay? And that's where we need to go in terms of looking at issues. So as I looked at this whole literature on trade and its applications for agriculture and food, I find some gaps, and I'll throw them out for you for discussion today. And the ability to go from trade to a particular county is one of the best things that happened in my career in my 20 years that I've seen. When I started out, I did industries, countries. Now I'm looking at companies and cities and regions and so on. So that's a great improvement in our understanding of trade. So as we do that, we seem to still kind of look at this short-term story, TPP. Once we do that, what happens? Okay, we never look at the long-term story. And we don't seem to do counterfactuals. For example, what if we didn't have NAFTA? What if we didn't have CAFTA? Or some of these experimental type approaches asking the question, what would the world look like without trade? And I go back to the Helpman and Krugman article that I referred to the last time I spoke. The world was, the whole land masses was in one place, okay? And we are producing and trading within that landscape, and suddenly God got angry and moved all the lands into North America, South America, Europe, Asia, and so on. Now, can we replicate the production that we had before when we were all together? Okay, and that's the kind of approach that we need to take. The second major problem I find out in all these analyses is that we continue to assume full employment in our analysis. These models continue to say we have full employment over and over and over again. I read a nice article a couple of weeks ago on JIE where they actually brought in the labor market into the trade model with search and matching cost, okay? And now the welfare change from trade can be scaled up or down by employment change. And there's nice empirical application of that, okay? So we could start looking at the labor market in particular to really kind of integrate that into the trade story that I talked about, going to regions, going to particular locations and industries, and start answering those questions, which is what I get all the time, so on trade and employment. Again, we seem to continue to focus on sectors and aggregates, and I think Bill talked about this quite a bit. I don't want to spend too much time on this, is that the 21st century trade is very different than the late 20th century trade, okay? We've got supply chains, we've got offshoring and breakup of the production process into pieces that we possibly couldn't have imagined, okay? And investment and intellectual property rights issues, okay? And this matters when it comes to trade negotiations, which I'm going to get to in a minute. So as we look at these trade models, these trade studies, and so on, and then you try to focus in on the agriculture trade dimension of that, you find out that even agriculture trade has changed substantially over the past 20 years, okay? When Uruguay Round was put together, the Quad countries pretty much dictated the conversation, okay? And at that time, the remaining developing countries accounted for less than a third of global agriculture exports or imports. Today, developing countries account for 48% of global exports and 42% of imports in the global agricultural context, okay? They've taken a bigger role, and they are important. In particular, you've seen this word from Goldman Sachs, BRIC countries, okay? Sometimes it's BRIC, sometimes it's BRIIC, sometimes it's BRICS, including South Africa, or BRIICS, any way you look at it, these are the major countries that have driven the trade changes that I just talked about, okay? And don't forget about Africa and Middle East and North America, because they are some of the fastest growing markets for imports, okay? But the landscape is such that you've got lots of new opportunities, but you also have competitors, okay? Now, Brazil is a major player in agriculture markets. Ukraine, the Black Sea exporters, are a major player in markets, okay? And there are countries like India, Thailand that continue to enter the market as and when needed, okay? So what you see is a situation where you've got more opportunities, but at the same time, more competitors. So how do we bring about trade reform in this particular context? I would say go back and do our homework that take trade to individual regions, because if you want to get TPP passed or TTIP passed or Japan-US bilateral to be passed, you need so many votes in US House of Representatives or the Senate. And these people are elected by regional folks. Okay? You go to Indian Parliament, they are elected from regional, areas, and likewise European Parliament. Okay? You've got to take the effects of trade down to a micro level. And when you get there, you got two options. One, you're going to demonstrate the benefit, or you're going to show them there is a safety net that can assure you that they can transition to a new sector or a new environment. Okay? And we continue to, that's part of the communication story I mentioned, that we continue to focus on trade outcomes. But in this new environment, we are talking about WTO being dead, or Doha deal being dead, and so on. And there's a lot of interest in bilaterals, okay? And there is a reason for the interest in bilaterals. Baldwin had a nice article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 2016, where he kind of revisited the issue of bilateral versus multilateral agreements. And he said, yes, bilateral agreements are very attractive because they can address newer issues where WTO does not have scope. For example, TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property rights, TRIMS, trade-related investment measures, offshoring, investment, and services, okay? So bilaterals give you that opportunity to sit down with them and go through the entire gamut of engagement that is new to the 21st century, okay? And WTO does not have scope in that particular context. But you have to go back to the fundamental principles of multilateralism. When GATT was established and recast into WTO, we still follow non-discrimination, which is the most favored nation status that we extend to other countries. We have reciprocity, okay? And we have no impairment rules that are part of the WTO. So for a bilateral to be effective, you need the multilateral system to hold the principles that we agreed to back in 1940s. And they are still needed if you want to do the bilateral. So you can do bilateral and then not protect the multilateral system, because the bilateral, there'll be slippage. And you go to the Japan for the first deal, and they are happy with you, and then somebody else goes to Japan, and they can get a better deal than what you've got, okay? We can continue on the slippery slope forever. So we have to protect the multilateral principles while we engage in bilaterals, which seem to offer the opportunity to engage on multiple dimensions that we missed out as part of WTO. Okay, those are my thoughts, and I'm open to questions when we get a chance later. Thank you.